listening to On the Payroll, my podcast about project delivery, consulting, Salesforce, and other CRMs such as Microsoft CE, for example. And I'm also really interested in topics such as leadership and teamwork. And these are the things that I touch upon when I talk to people that I like and have such amazing conversations. Well, there's a reason why I do the podcast. It's just an excuse really to just have really great conversations. In today's podcast, I speak to Chris Pearson and we talk about his journey in the Salesforce ecosystem and how he got to where he is today. He's the director for the Salesforce platform at Jostens, and he's got quite deep expertise across many different clouds such as Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Marketing Cloud, Revenue Cloud, and I believe they also use MuleSoft to integrate lots and lots of different clouds. And we talk about the lessons he learned getting acclimatized to different aspects of Salesforce and what he's got to share in terms of managing such an enterprise size org and all the intricacies and complexities that come with it. I really hope that you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Thank you very much. Good morning, Chris. Hello, and welcome to my podcast called On the Payroll. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here. It's Friday. Couldn't be better.
Fantastic. I hear you've just come back from your honeymoon. So congratulations again.
Thank you. Well rested, and ready to tackle the world's problems afterwards.
Fantastic. I always begin my podcast by asking my guests to tell us the story of how you got to this point, and feel free to branch off in any direction that you wish to flesh out the story of Chris Pearson.
Sure. Well, I can start off with just who I am right now and talk a little bit about, I guess, how I got here. My name is Chris Pearson. I'm the Director of Salesforce Development for a company called Jostens. And Jostens is an American-based manufacturer that works with schools, academic universities and institutions to provide all of the memorabilia and memories and physical products that go along with students as they progress in their journeys. Anything from class rings to yearbooks, to cap and gown, announcements, all of that. And at Jostens, we run Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Revenue Cloud, Marketing Cloud, MuleSoft, and Tableau. So there's a lot of Salesforce that I'm responsible for. We've got 2,000 users of Sales and Service Cloud and a bunch of different Marketing Cloud organizations. And within the company, we have 3 different divisions. We've got what we call the Yearbook division, the Scholastic, which takes care of kindergarten through 12th grade, and then college. So a little bit about me. I started my career as a business analyst. My college degree was in finance. I wasn't a big fan of finance when going through university, and I was lucky enough to somehow land an entry-level business analyst job and fell in love with it because I knew I loved technology, and then I had that business background. And from there, I was able to grow from there into multiple different industries. I started out in financial services and then jumped from there to larger financial services organizations, a big bank called JP Morgan, where I was a BA/PM, starting to kind of build my skills as an analyst and both as kind of a project manager. From there, I made a jump into high tech, a company called BMC Software. And that's where I got to get my first exposure to Salesforce. It was probably like many professionals thrown onto a Salesforce project. The company had acquired another company and our company was running Salesforce, and they were running Salesforce and had their own marketing automation systems. And they said, Chris, you're going to be the lead analyst to smash these 2 things together. And really I stumbled and fumbled my way through that project, learning a lot of hard lessons along the way. But I came out with an understanding of the platform capabilities. And I kind of knew that this was something that I found more interesting because it wasn't so opaque. As a person without like a technical background, understanding code and reading code was really, frankly, putting me to sleep. It was boring. But Salesforce, being able to really understand how things connected and in an easier user interface was really exciting to me. From there, I was able to jump into a little bit larger of an organization that was implementing Salesforce in the media industry. And I like to think of my career as taking a jump from being an IT individual to working in that point, marketing operations. So marketing operations gave me a completely different view from what IT is usually responsible for, which is, support tickets, incidents, project management, and all of that. And from my marketing operations role, I got a different perspective all around generating leads, the quality of the leads, and how that integration and marketing automation can really help and enable sales professionals. From there, I actually then made a jump to go be kind of what you'd call in the industry a little bit of a solo admin. I was working in a high-tech organization that had Salesforce that had about 300 or 400 users, and they knew that they weren't getting the best value out of Salesforce. And so as I see companies now, those Salesforce admins and those technology professionals are really getting embedded in the business. And so this was about the midpoint of my career, and it was really exciting because I got a different perspective on the sales operations side. So before I cared about the lead quality and the handoff to sales, but as in sales operations, I was like, okay, give me the leads, but I also care about forecast, enablement. How can I work with my customer success team and enable them better from a renewal standpoint, and a whole bunch of different problems from a sales perspective. Even working with an inside sales organization to spin up what we call a power dialer or a computer telephony integration so that our inside sales reps could be making those outbound calls and all of that. And from there, I now had my IT, my sales ops, my marketing ops background, and then I got the opportunity to join a commercial real estate company that was implementing a really large instance of Salesforce. So they were moving off custom apps and they wanted to move to Salesforce. And so that was really, really exciting, and got to lead that organization, grow a team from one single business analyst to a team of admins, architects, QA professionals, and then inherited that custom application as well. And so it was really fun. The company was doing so well, we got acquired by a much larger organization. And so that very early first project where I was kind of thrown together, smashing two companies together many years ago, now I was at the forefront. This was a $2 billion acquisition. We're talking thousands of users, tons of custom functionality. And I was a leader, a frontline leader on the integration of those two companies. And so learned a lot about working with large organizations, really the negotiation, prioritization. How long do you have to actually implement these two companies? There's a lot of tough decisions you have to make along the way because those businesses are running in two separate systems and they're experiencing pain because they don't know what the other hand. It's like having two hands and not knowing what the right hand is doing while the left hand is doing something else. So we were under a lot of pressure to deliver. We were able to achieve that. I had a great time, and then was looking for my next challenge, and I arrived at Jostens. So that's the long story short, maybe, about me.
Oh, fantastic. So I made some notes, and there's lots of places we can go. So the first thing, actually, you mentioned that you were at BMC, and so for a short time, so was I. And BMC, as I understand it, is a service-oriented company with ticketing and IT and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to get that out there. But it sounds like you have a very wide, how Salesforce calls it, a 360 degree view of the customer, and you've sat in every single division that touches the customer, from leads right up to post sales. And that gives you so I don't know very many people like you, because, even in our industry, we kind of, I don't know why. A lot of the projects that I've been on have mostly been service-based, service cloud, so to speak, on Salesforce side of things. But before that, I was with Microsoft, so the support functionality and the call centers and the contact centers that we have here. So most of my experience have been that, even though I've done some sales and some marketing side. But you have a more comprehensive view of this from what I hear, not only from a implementation point of view, but also from business operations and functionality. And so that makes you a very rare breed, I think. So lots of places I could go. I would like to start with, so you were talking about marketing. So tell me a bit more about what were the challenges that you encountered when you first moved from IT, with the ticketing, with the managing of infrastructure, possibly, and the support functionality, moving into marketing, that sort of world. What were the challenges that you saw for yourself and for how you were implementing the systems for your users?
Yeah, that's a great question. There were several different challenges. I probably categorized them both as either business and operational, and then technology. So I was in what was called a global role, which meant that we're really sort of in charge of helping each of our regions, around the globe, to adopt marketing automation, get to some level of standardization, even though there's differences in the way that those companies and groups go to market. And so I think back to the disparity between the US and the UK. The US had no marketing automation system at all. So that was a very heavy education on what can marketing automation do? How, what is a lead? What are lead statuses? What does the funnel look like? And what does an automated campaign look like that is not something that we called a spray and pray, which is a funny name for a campaign. It's basically sending a message to an entire list. And so we would kind of joke that the US for this particular company, their go-to-market strategy was download the phone book and send them an email. So really a lot of education on the power of segmentation, targeting, what you can do with interactive campaigns, as far as based upon their response, you can trigger a different message. If they don't respond to the first message, you don't need to recreate an entire email, simply change the subject, try again. But then I think about the other side of the challenges that I mentioned, technology challenges. And that was on the UK side of the fence. So they were using a marketing automation tool, different one from what the sort of the enterprise platform was. So they had their expectations. They had a different way of going to market where they didn't even have a technology. They weren't equipped to actually build their own campaigns. What they came up with was campaign briefs, and then they'd work with the vendor to build very bespoke campaigns within the system to execute. And we were changing that model. We were not only changing the model and moving them to a different technology platform, but we were also going to kind of what I'd like to call as be able to care and feed for yourself. Meaning you need to learn how the constructs of this marketing automation tool work so that you can migrate your campaign activities to it and run them yourself. We're moving away from that bespoke model in a separate tool, and more about standardization where each team is equipped with the data that they need to execute on those campaigns.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So when you move from marketing into sales, what kind of mental shifts did you have to make in order to transition successfully?
Oh, good question. I spent so much of my time around leads, and not the object in Salesforce, but the concept of a lead. How do you warm, qualify, hand off a lead? Move into sales operations side, they're like, look, we are working with opportunities. I'm speaking in object constructs, but at the end of the day, they're working with transactions. They cared a little bit about that new business development, those potential prospects, but the different focus was much more on the pipeline itself. I've got someone interested on the phone. I've got them, I've had a webinar with them. How can I manage this entire transaction all the way through to close? How can I give my sales leaders the visibility into exactly what products we're pitching? So that was a big change, like not just the fact that you had a customer, but what offers, what programs, bundles were we pitching or potentially selling to that customer? And the other main thing that they really cared about was that close date. That shift, that if that close date moved out of the quarter, we had to set up a bunch of red alerts, alarms, emails, all the way up to the CEO. We were very laser focused on hitting our numbers from a quarterly basis because Salesforce was really responsible for the forecast to Wall Street. So that was a big change to move from all about that demand gen and prospecting to focused on transacting.
What were the unique challenges that you found working with the different groups of people? Because you got the marketing type who are creative, and then you've got the salespeople who are quite different, as you say, quite laser focused on their quarterly targets. What are the challenges that you found working with different divisions, so to speak?
I think it comes down to finding out what motivates people. Not only, there's the what motivates individuals, as far as what excites them, what are their strengths, but then also what speaks to them. One of my favorite phrases that I adopted from my stint in sales ops was that salespeople are coin operated. And it took me a minute to sort of understand what that means. But that means that they're in sales for a reason. They want to make money. They want to close and earn that commission. So I found myself early on in my job, implementing new functionality and being really excited about it, hosting webinars, and the reaction was anywhere from a yawn to a not even listening. And I realized I had to change my message and figure out a way to speak to them. How can I position these features and functionality in a way that speaks their language, that makes their lives easier, that finds a way for them to earn more money, those kinds of things. And once that finally clicked, I was able to achieve a lot more.
Wow, that's really coin operated. That's a new term that I found, and I will find an opportunity to use that in the future. Thank you for that. You also mentioned that you had to learn more about the negotiation and the prioritization when you took on board more clouds and more kind of responsibilities. That must have been quite challenging because suddenly you've got a lot more stakeholders to deal with. How did you manage that?
Well, I can tell you, I still haven't figured it out. It's a lot more art than it is science. As IT professionals, as analysts and all of that, we love to be able to use data and to be able to use metrics and numbers to make our decisions. But sometimes reality, it blurs a lot. In my experience, sales, anything that's going to have a financial impact typically starts to get more eyes, more attention, and more resources. So, in some regards, we're always doing things for sales, but we have to balance that with the needs of marketing and service. And the way I go about it is really understanding what is the problem we're trying to solve? What's the impact of not doing it right now or doing it later? And if it's going to take a certain amount of time that's not acceptable to that business, are there things that we can do in the interim? Are there workarounds, or are there other activities that we can do that can make them feel better? And sometimes the answer is no. And that's where it's just a matter of delivering a hard message. But as long as you're being transparent, as far as this is what it is, these are the amount of resources I have, this is what I can achieve, I found in my experience, people are understanding.
So right now you're responsible for multiple clouds. And that's, if you're able to, I'd be interested to hear how you're using the Revenue Cloud, which is CPQ, in your current business. So I have in the back of my mind a question that I want to pose, but if you can just give me a bit of grounding around that.
Sure. One of our divisions I mentioned at Jostens is called Yearbook. And so a yearbook, for those who may not know, it's very much like a US-based product, but it's something that is typically received in high school, and it's really just a book of pictures and memories that commemorate the year. And if you think about the nuances of that book, every yearbook at every school is completely different. I still actually have my 4 yearbooks from my time in high school. They're gathering dust somewhere in my parents' house, some locked away in a closet, but each year they look completely different. And so it's a very bespoke product. It's a product that is also sold to students throughout the year at different price points. So just like, think about when you were buying an airline ticket. If you were to buy a ticket a month or two in advance, you're going to have a certain price. But if you need to buy that ticket a week or a couple of days in advance, that price is going to be higher. So our business reps are using Salesforce CPQ along with some custom functionality to not only model those transactions, but also set up all of the manufacturing rules that go into making that book. The number of pages, the ink, the cover type, whether they're in sheets. There's special rules that go along with all of our go-to-market strategies that need to be embedded within Salesforce CPQ so that they can tell our manufacturing plant exactly what needs to be built according to specifications, and also tell the customer what it's going to cost, as well as the offset with those revenues. So if you think about it, you're selling the book to students and you're earning money, but then there's the price of the book itself. And so what you're doing within Salesforce is you're trying to balance that throughout the year, because your goal is really for the school to almost owe zero. In some instances, the yearbook can actually be a profit center for a school. And so imagine all the complexity of trying to model that within Salesforce, where you've got sales reps that are inputting this information, and the manufacturing system that's also integrating directly into Salesforce and making changes to their plan, making changes to their actual invoice. And Salesforce is the way of giving them visibility into that.
That is absolutely fascinating. Where I wanted to go with my question was around ownership. If you were a sales cloud, for example, say a company just uses Sales Cloud, in theory, that would be owned by the sales division. For example, you've got your sales admin or sales ops, as you call it, who would manage data, manage the rules, manage the workflow, any automation, as an example. So what I see with a lot of the projects that I have had in the past, that there is no rule with regards to how a company might define data and system ownership. So broadly, as I mentioned, Sales Cloud might be owned by sales. Marketing Cloud, if that's all they have, potentially just owned by marketing. And then the tricky one is Service Cloud, because it's a cost center generally. But you have so many that you're in charge of. How is your division the owner of all the clouds? How do you manage the requests that come in for features and functionality and releases and so on and so forth?
Yeah,
in your
that's a good
company?
question. I would say it's a little bit of a blend with an organization of our size. So speaking at like the enterprise level, a company with an organization of 1,000 employees, 500 employees, it may look different. So I'm just going to speak about sort of what the way that it's set up and the pros and cons of how it works in my world. And so the way that I look at it is the data itself is for the most part owned by an enterprise data team. We have a back office system, a customer master that owns whether or not this company is an account or not. There's legal requirements and all of that. We own the functionality around that data is the way that I think of it. So, and then those individual business groups own the business processes that manipulate and support that data. So and then if we were to think about from a service and marketing cloud standpoint, the way that I think of it is we own the ability to get data out of sales data into marketing cloud. That's where we really fit. That's the niche. We don't own the creative assets. We don't own the strategy for the journeys that are built or anything like that. We own getting you your data so that you can build your right segment and execute on the campaigns. From a service cloud standpoint, we own the functionality of how Service Cloud is set up. But as far as their process for managing cases and SLAs, that's owned within the service call center organization and their own respective business analysts.
Now that you've laid it out, it sounds really clear. That's the way to do it the right way. Thank you for that, because because the projects that I've been on have not been as all-encompassing as what you currently sit in right now. And there's always, obviously, how I approach it is always from a consulting point of view. I've always worked with partners. And so I'm observing the client or the end user and how they're managing things and the things or the road bumps that they come across because they aren't able to define the ownership of system, of processes, of data. And that's where, I keep hitting some roadblocks on. And thank you for clarifying that. So now I have a much better framework. However, saying that, what you do have is you do have size behind you, and therefore having enterprise team, having a data team, having the kind of framework and the policies that you have makes sense. Scaling down, how would you do it if tomorrow you got a job in a company that's maybe a quarter the size? What would the best practices be? So you can't, you don't have the budget for the enterprise team, the data team.
Yeah, totally. I feel like that was my stint when I was talking about when I was in sales, my time during sales operations. What they actually wanted to call the team was business operations. It just, for some reason, it didn't roll off the tongue. All the sales reps called the sales ops. So it's much easier to kind of equate that to. And as a business operations team, what we really said was we own the data within CRM. And in that role, we were primarily supporting sales, but we also needed to support the legal team, finance, consumers of sales data, because each of those different groups has a say in the sales process. If you're about to close a transaction, chances are you're going to involve our legal department to actually get that contract signed. They needed to have visibility. They needed to have workflows. They needed to have a standardized quote and order form, which was actually one of the projects we implemented using the company's own CPQ platform at the time. And so from a legal standpoint, that was the way that we supported them. And then the other groups that I mentioned, we really just tried to work with them to enable their needs, but ultimately they all came to kind of a central part, and we simply prioritized those requests and tried to kind of set up a monthly cadence of releases and set up reviews to actually review what is on the backlog, what's coming next, and then what has yet to be done. It seemed to work well with a smaller organization.
It sounds like, from how you're describing it, that they're sensible people. In the UK, for example, there's another question before I go on to that. Who did your business operations team report to? Would it be the finance director, the sales?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so we had a senior director of business operations who reported to the COO, which seems very logical because that COO is working with legal, with finance, with sales. Finance cares about that forecast. What are we expecting? What are we projecting, and all of that. So that model seemed to work well because that COO kind of usually has a broad purview.
Again, that makes perfect sense listening to you, because that hasn't been the case in a lot of the companies that I've worked with over here. And there are conflicts of interest, obviously, because the what you call the business operations team would have to sit under, say, sales, in which case the service side may get their requirements stamped down because there's no one to fight for their corner, etc. But having it in the structure that you've just described just make a whole lot of sense.
Well, it makes sense, I would say, in an academic definition is what I think you're saying, but there's still politics. Organizations are dysfunctional by nature. That not every group gets their needs met. Like the legal teams, HR teams, usually they're the low rungs on the ladder. It's always chasing after things that impact the bottom line, which usually fall in the sales realm, sales and sometimes marketing. So I totally agree. It sounds great, but the reality of it was it's a very much push and pull.
It still sounds like multiple steps ahead of where we could be here in the UK. I think that's a model that's not as common as it should be. So I still, the line of politics are much more blurred over here. So you mentioned a couple of things earlier on that I want to touch on. Right in the beginning, you're talking about mashing two organizations together. You've been in situations where the company you've been in has been acquired, so there are integration requirements and things like that. Have you been in a situation where you've had to, I guess, integrate two orgs or put, from two to one? And how do you deal with the technical debt?
Oh gosh, that's a good one. A lot of my most recent acquisition really was complex. You had a much larger organization that had a fairly mature Salesforce org, and then a smaller organization that was acquired because my organization, because we were exceeding their business. They wanted our business to be a part of their business because we were doing it better than them. But we had some complexities in our own organization. We had Salesforce, but we also had custom apps that had been built for decades and grown with functionality that that may or may not be used, functionality that was very complex but served us a purpose. And so it was it is very challenging. It was and still continues to be able to port that into another org, which may be running different processes, may not be set up that exact same way. Some of the initial challenges were really just changing the security model, becoming more open. Think about from a private model to a public read. That's kind of how we'd equate to it in Salesforce. But if you think about that, that's maybe flipping a couple switches in Salesforce. But the ramifications from a business standpoint and the culture, all of a sudden my opportunity that was only visible to me, you're saying everybody else can see that. There was a lot of reverberations in that cultural change that we had to work through as a technology team. We had to account for the nuances and still find ways to keep things confidential. So it was a little bit of a push and pull, figuring out a middle ground to work through things. Now, you mentioned technical debt. That's a tough one. I wanted to understand a little bit more about, how do you see that actually impacting? So it's obviously something we all live with, but can you tell me a little bit more about what you were looking for in regards to a migration or an org merge?
More around how do you unify things? How do you is there a shortcut through it? Is there maybe I'm thinking about it along the lines of things that, from a project point of view, when we've had to deal with it, a lot of decisions the customer has to make, and one of the bigger projects, they've decided not to make the decision because it was just too complex to merge. Mm-hmm. And that they just carried on running two systems in parallel, and we had to do all sorts of things to make it both work. It just didn't make sense to me to do it in the way that they've done it. And I was just wondering if you have a better way because you've gone through an acquisition and a merger.
Gosh, it's a tough one. Oftentimes I think one of the modes that I always seem to revert back into is what's the estimate to implement change? You've got your requirements, and how long is it going to take to build that functionality? What we don't do, or at least me personally, maybe other IT pros do it, is build in some technical debt retirement time into that estimate. Build in refactoring time. It is really hard to stick to that because what we all want to do is we all want to get that date out to our business leaders, our executives. How long is it going to take to do? And kind of like what I loved about one of your recent posts, where do you start to trim things? You may trim it in development, you may trim it in QA, you may cut corners in change management and readiness. To me, there are way more forms of technical debt besides just systematic. It could be cutting it out from QA. It could be, in my experience, maybe not writing down your test cases. All right, we're gonna test this out because we don't have time to document things. And once we've validated some things, we're gonna give you the thumbs up. That is technical debt, because guess what? Next time you implement a change, you're gonna have to rethink how all those scenarios are. And from a change management standpoint, technical debt can mean cutting corners. Let's just go ahead and get it live, then we'll tell our reps or our users how to use it. Well, guess what? They may not be ready for it. They may be discovering things. They may be reacting negatively. You may have a PR campaign, a negative PR campaign that you've now got to deal with, which may take up time for your analysts and your support team when they should be focused on either requirements management or supporting incidents. But now they're answering questions like how-tos and other low-level questions that could be solved with better planning. So I think, to me, your question about technical debt means that let's look at it in more than one lens besides just the technology side of it.
Thank you. That's exactly why I love talking to people on my podcast, because you've just shared perspective with me that I hadn't looked at it that way before. Obviously, I am aware of what happens when you cut corners, but calling it technical, it is absolutely true, because there's rework, there's rethinking, there's redesigning that has to go on, because we've somehow taken a shortcut, either purposefully, or you made a decision to do so, or kind of accidentally because we ran out of time, we just went ahead without doing the documentation, for example, or not doing all the test cases. But rework's you have to pay for it down the line somewhere. So thank you for that. That was just a bing, something like that. You have also worked with, you mentioned global operations. You mentioned working with people in the UK. What other locations have you worked with in terms of people and culture?
Well, Europe at large. In my last role, we're a global organization, so we kind of had the America, the EMEA, Europe, Middle East, Africa, as well as APAC, Asia Pacific. So really, in my experience, I've worked all around the globe, and with those different groups across the world, and they each have their own culture, differences of ways to go to market, and but there is commonality in those different organizations, whether it was high tech or media or financial services. It's still, you could still see that culture of that region coming through in the way that they approach technology.
So were they the stakeholders, were they the end users, or were they part of your team?
All three. So I would typically be working with the technology groups in each of those regions, who would then own the relationship with their business.
I see. What the question that I wanted to the question that I wanted to pose was, how do you work with a team that might be dispersed around the globe and get them to perform at a level that you're expecting? But it sounds like the relationship is slightly more different than them being within your team.
How do you get them to work well with a team? A lot of it comes down to building that baseline of trust. Because when you start working with a new team, or when your company's acquired and you're starting to work with strangers, for lack of a better word, you don't know what they know. They don't know what you know. And that can really cause a lot of friction. Sometimes whether it's trying to prove who knows more, who's smarter. There may be other commitments that those groups have that you aren't aware of. So it's finding a way to build a baseline of trust. And for me, I've done that in one of two ways. In-person meetings, so in-person travel. You really we can't escape that. That's the best way to do things. But, with the state of the world today, with the cost of doing that, time away from family, maybe your other commitments, it's just not always possible. Other ways I've done that is kind of setting up water cooler time, getting outside of a meeting that has a specific purpose and setting up a recurring half-hour block, 20-minute block with a couple individuals just to chat. You can cancel that. You can move that according to schedules. And I've used that to build relationships and sometimes give people a little bit of a heads up. By the way, I'm going to be introducing a new requirement about this, or this new functionality is coming for this specific region. You may be interested, so you may want to go look good in front of your business by sharing this. So those are just some tactics that I've used, but I haven't figured it out yet.
I just realized that we talked a lot about just the work, and I wanted to focus a bit more about you and your values. However, just listening to you, I can probably name a few things. I can tell that you are very excited about technology. You are a very much a people person, and you care about the outcome and making sure that a business gets what they need, and you have a very high emotional intelligence in order to get what you need from the people around you, regardless of where they sit within your organization. And therefore, that's the picture that I've painted based on the conversation we've just had. I'd like you to share, what are the other values that are important to you?
Well, you were the ones that you just espoused. It's pretty tough to top that. I really think I don't have too much to add other than understanding where people are at. To me, that is really understanding where they're at in their journey, in if they're a team member, or if they're a business. What is a business leader or a business partner, an external consultant? Like, what do they need? What can I do to make them successful? What are their needs? How do they like to be communicated to? Those are things that are really near and dear to my heart, because I feel like I've had many managers over my career, and I've had many different stints, and I've internalized experiences that I didn't like. And I've kind of, just like as a kid, I always go back and I remember, experiences with teachers or parents, and reminding myself, if I'm going to be a teacher one day, I'm not going to do this. Or when I have kids of my own, I'm not going to do this. And I feel like somehow that has seeped into my professional brain. All of those different experiences where I've gotten my feelings hurt, or I've been upset with the results or lack of results, or a certain micro moment. And I really try and put a lot more care into identifying those and over communicating with people so that they understand, I know I'm doing my best to understand your position, and my background as a PM, as a BA, performing QA, working in the business. I feel like that gives me a little bit of an edge over the next person to understand their perspective.
I get that, totally get that. So let me flip the question then. What are your non-negotiables or your deal breakers when it comes to people that you work with?
I would say trust. I mean, it starts at that. If I start to lose trust in someone, or if I can't earn or achieve a certain level of trust with someone, it's going to be very difficult for me to work with them. And trust can come down to doing what you're going to say, following through. It can mean hitting deadlines. It can be making accurate estimates. It can be on the business side, like, I will support you in this, and the request that the business is asking of me, relying on what they're saying as truth. Those things are, it's really hard for me to negotiate on a level of trust. Outside of that, I would say having some form of humor and flexibility. We know that we can't always predict things. And in the world of IT, the world of Salesforce, whatever your domain is, things are going to change. And being very rigid about a plan and about wanting everything to be wrapped up in a box with a bow is something that I find really challenging to be able to work with someone like that, who holds those values, because in the professional world, it's just not everything is black and white. So I guess those would be two. I don't know if I answered your question as accurately as you wanted, but I'd say those would be two of the values for me that are critical.
I want to be very mindful of your time, but there are places that I would still like to go into, more along the perhaps a more personal journey, because you've mentioned about things that you've internalized that you don't want to emulate from teachers and things like that. And I'd like to go into that a little bit more, if that's okay, in maybe a part 2 at some point.
I love that. I love that.
Because I think a lot of what we talked about today is what would probably occur in an interview, in a job interview. Tell me all the things that you've done and all the clouds that you've worked with, which are super interesting to me. But the other thing that is also interesting to me is the person behind it. And what I like to learn is about the personal journey of the things that you've learned along the way. Who are the mentors that you've had who've made an impact to your life, and so on and so forth. So don't mind, like I said, I am very mindful of your time. I want to be respectful. And I would love a second opportunity to just talk a little bit more about that, if that's okay.
I look forward to that.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciated this. And I'm looking forward to the second part of this conversation.
Thanks, Pei. It's great to be here. And thank you so much for having me.